Welcome to another podcast recorded at the Rockwell Foundation Berlin, where I'm talking to some of the economists who are creating the next edition of the Handbook of Labor Economics. My name is Tim Phillips. Some policymakers advocate raising the minimum wage as an effective way to combat poverty. But others have argued that it destroys jobs and raises prices. So who's right? That's a question I put to Arindrajit Dube of the University of Massachusetts Amherst when I spoke to him.
So we've learned a lot about this question over the last 25 years. I think there's definitely a range of beliefs and evidence on this question. One thing that we have increasingly learned, though, is that the simple idea that when you raise the minimum wage, it has to cost jobs is probably not correct. And the more sophisticated theories of how the labor market works helps explain why that may be. So, for example, if you raise the minimum wage, there's several other things that could happen. For one, it could be that it's easier to recruit workers and retain workers. And if workers are more likely to stick around, then maybe you end up reducing turnover instead of reducing jobs. And that's definitely something we've seen some evidence on. Another is that it might be possible for companies, when all low-wage companies are facing the same increase in minimum wage, to pass through some of those wage cost increase as higher prices. And consumers are often willing to pay a bit more, and it turns out that they do. So there's actually a lot of price pass-through, so consumers overall pay a bit more so low-wage workers can earn more. And ability to do that helps also reduce the incentive for companies to cut jobs. So overall, what we find is the evidence, broadly speaking, both in US and in Europe, suggests that minimum wage increases in the last 20 years haven't really had very large impact on jobs overall. But there are different studies, find different evidence, of course, and that's part of what we're trying to really measure.
How do you get good evidence on this? Because if you change something, it's very hard to work out exactly whether the result is the result of that change.
Exactly. So economists are very interested in getting causal evidence of policies. So how do you get causal evidence for minimum wages? Well, it partly depends on the context. For example, in the United States, the minimum wage is different across different places. So for instance, there's 30 states in US that have state-level minimum wage, 20 that do not. And those 30 states have raised the minimum wage a lot in the last 10 years, and the other 20 states have not raised it at all. That creates a lot of variation. So I can now look at workers, especially let's say workers without a college degree who are less than 40 years old. They're likely to be lower wage workers. How did workers of that characteristic, how did they experience finding jobs, keeping jobs, the wages they were paid when they had a job in a state like Massachusetts or California that raised the minimum wage versus another state like Texas that did not? So that's one way in which economists use what's called a difference in difference. When I compare change in one area, that's kind of my treatment group, as it were, using a randomized controlled trial type metaphor, and then you have a control group which did not increase the minimum wage. In a country like UK or Germany, where you have a national minimum wage, you can't quite do that, but you can do something related. So you can look at areas where the minimum wage is more binding. For example, here in Germany, it's a lot more binding in Eastern Germany than in Western Germany. So you can compare across different regions, like in UK, in London versus, let's say, Northern Ireland, very different bite of the same policy. So compare low-wage workers, how they fared in these different areas before and after the policy.
What do we know about the benefits of receiving a higher minimum wage?
So what we know is that when wages go up, people end up having greater family incomes. They rely a little less on social assistance, public assistance. And so those are some of the most immediate benefits, but there may be also knock-on effects, health effects, and effects on crime. So there's some interesting evidence suggesting that maybe crime is affected as low-wage workers have higher earnings.
So you can make a calculation that there are benefits to the public purse from increasing minimum wage, the cost of crime, the cost of giving benefits to people.
There certainly are some. In the U.S. context, for instance, we find that there's reduced take-up of public assistance that includes food stamps. So the government then is paying out less to low-income families in terms of food stamps. That helps save money for taxpayers. Of course, you have to be careful with that. At some point, if the minimum wage is too high and that does end up reducing jobs, then you're also paying families unemployment benefits. But again, I think the evidence to date suggests that moderate minimum wage increases haven't seemed to do that nearly as much as reduced public benefit use.
Today, the minimum wage isn't even high enough to keep a fully employed mother and a baby out of poverty. This is fundamentally wrong.
Certain types of politicians stand against the minimum wage. For example, there was the effort to raise the federal minimum wage in the US, and that ultimately failed.
Raising the minimum wage, that's not helping. What's going to happen, and what's been proven to happen, is when you do that, these small businesses fire many of their employees.
You said very recently you would consider.
But how popular is a higher minimum wage with the public?
The minimum wage is very popular globally and also in higher income countries, and that includes United States. Every time the minimum wage is actually put on the ballot in America, it passes. It passes with around 65% voters consistently support it increasing, even fairly ambitious minimum wage increases. In other countries too, for example, in UK, at this point, there's broad-based consensus across the Conservative Party and Labour Party for a strong high minimum wage. Those two parties don't necessarily agree on a lot of things, but they do agree on having a minimum wage, which is interesting. In the US, that's less so. The voters are a lot more unified in their support for minimum wages than politicians in the U.S.
One of the innovations in working over the last decade and a half has been this increasing gig work. People who are self-employed, they are maybe not earning a great deal and they're maybe not covered by the minimum wage. Is that the case? Does minimum wage bind or not bind for them?
Right. So the answer to that question differs greatly by where we're talking about, and that's really an evolving area. If gig workers are not classified as being covered under standard employment or labor law, then the minimum wage is not going to be binding. They'll be thought of as self-employed. In some states in the U.S. and even some cities have passed regulations, however, with minimum wage for gig workers. So this is an evolving area where even when gig workers are not considered standard statutory employees, maybe there will be a different minimum wage for them in some places. But this is certainly something that is of increasing interest to policymakers because gig work is increasing in its incidence.
And also, there are some insecure jobs that have very flexible hours, potentially 0 hours contracts as well. Do we know what a rise in minimum wage does to the hours that people work under those contracts?
Yeah, there's been some study of that, for example, in the UK. In general, there doesn't seem to be a lot of impact of the minimum wage on use of 0 hour contracts. However, of course, the presence of that does impact what it means when the minimum wage rises for someone's paycheck. Obviously, if there's a lot of variability in hours, that's not going to go away. And that might mean sometime, even with a higher wage, earnings is quite volatile or low.
There are many people who are worried about large-scale technological unemployment. Basically, they will be automated out of jobs. Are we going to have to be thinking creatively about how we support people on low incomes and potentially no incomes far into the future?
I think it's absolutely an important question. What happens if automation displaces work? Am I particularly concerned about that right now? I'm not. And one of the reasons is that if you look at high-income countries generally, but also US in particular, unemployment rate is very low. And in fact, we have recovered from the recession following the pandemic with really breathtaking pace. If anything, workers have quit low-wage jobs because there's more opportunities. So it doesn't strike me that technological unemployment is really the main challenge facing low-wage workers. I think rather job quality and thinking about how to improve job quality, be it through regulation, be it through skills, etc. All those are really the key question as opposed to automation leading to great reductions in jobs. One of the things that automation has done is to reduce the demand for jobs that were more routine jobs that could be easily substituted for by computers. That has generally hurt low-wage, low-skill workers. Artificial intelligence, however, might actually end up playing a quite different role that might complement the workers at the bottom of the pay scale, which actually could have a potentially more salutary impact.
Yeah, these are interesting future questions, but it's encouraging to hear that policy seems to be solving some of our problems around low pay today. Thank you very much for talking about that.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. The Rockwell Foundation Berlin Institute for the Economy and the Future of Work is providing new knowledge to inform public debate and to create the best possible basis for policy making. Find out more at rfberlin.com.